Twitter isn't real life. That's what people tell you. I hear people say that all the time. And there's some truth to the statement. In real life, people have a range of views and they have a range of political ideologies. On Twitter, they skew one way. They skew heavily in the zero COVID direction and they skew heavily left of center. And to be perfectly honest, that's where I find myself as well. But, I like to follow data. So Twitter, it's not a microcosm of America. It's a certain percentage of people who happen to be active. The people who use it the most, who tweet the most, are a tiny subset of the people even on Twitter. And that already doesn't represent America. The views on COVID policy don't represent America. Twitter is not a representation of the midpoint of any experts. In fact, the truth is, we don't know what most scientific experts think. We've never polled them or surveyed them. Twitter is a tiny snapshot of what people who choose to go on Twitter say. That's all it is. But it does affect the real world. This is what people miss. It has real world implications. Number one, when journalists go to quote people in the real life, in their real articles that are read by many of people, they are often quite lazy and they just pick whoever they saw tweeted about the topic. And so you find quotes in popular media outlets repeatedly from the same people. They're not the best virologists. In fact, they may be a no-name virologist who never had a lab of their own. They're just somebody who tweets a lot on the topic and they have the simulacrum of credentials. They have credential-ish kind of, they feel like they could be an expert in the topic and they just tweet a lot about it and the journalist gravitates to those people. And we have that in all sorts of disciplines. We also have people who, are real academics, one of whom is Ashish Jha. And he's somebody who, if we're perfectly honest, I think is a thoughtful guy. I got nothing against the guy. Nothing against him. I disagree with a bunch of his views over the time, but I got nothing against the guy. I had followed his work previously. But his work, to be honest, wasn't that much in infectious disease epidemiology. It just simply wasn't. He had other interests. COVID comes around, he does a lot of tweeting, and he finds himself constantly in the news shows, CNN, et cetera, et cetera. I think I read a stat that he was on TV in a few-month period of time in COVID like 60,000 times, or he's mentioned 60,000 times in the lay media. That's a lot. He's always on TV. He has a certain midpoint point of view. He's on TV. I think he articulates it fairly decently. And that publicity has led, I think, to his appointment as the new White House COVID czar. He's going to take over for Jeff. He's going to run the White House COVID plan. So he has a very important real health policy role as a result. Now, if we're perfectly honest, people can say, and people do say, that, he's a perfectly suitable person for the job. He'll do the job as well as anyone else will, and I have no reason to think otherwise. But he wouldn't have had the job. I do think he wouldn't have had the job if he hadn't been doing a lot of tweeting. Tweeting led to the media appearances, and the media appearances led to the job. So Twitter did affect real life. It affected what real people think, and it affected this guy getting this real job. And I think that's interesting. Now, I read a really interesting article about this topic, and it has this quote. Let me read it to you. But Ashish Jha is already drawing criticism from some public health experts who believe that he has been too cozy with the Biden administration and often echoed White House talking points. One of them, Waleed Jalad, a health policy professor from University of Pittsburgh and somebody who I quite like, said on Twitter, quote, certain public health experts, end quote, who are, quote, tweeting and writing support for the administration's policy 2 minutes after a policy is released should not be viewed as objective and impartial. That's what Waleed says. And he confesses in this article he was thinking about Ashish when he said it. It's totally true. I mean, I remember one instance where there's some major policy change and this guy dropped an op-ed in the minute after that policy change. He must have known it was coming. Later in the article, it says something that I think is totally ridiculous. Here's what it says. Dr. Jha said through a Brown University spokeswoman that none of his past statements had been coordinated with the White House, that he had, quote, never received specific talking points, end quote, but Ms. Irani, the PR person, added, he is on a list of experts who regularly receive, quote, updates and announcements from the White House communications team. So you don't receive White House talking points, but you receive updates and announcements ahead of time that's non-public to you and a few others. Guess what? Those are talking points. What are you talking about? Those are the talking points. You're not getting some updates and announcements. Those are talking points. And that allowed you to write these op-eds preemptively. And you are echoing those talking points. And whether you like it or not, if you look at the body of your tweets, you've been awfully supportive of the White House, which is really awfully cozy with Biden, which is probably the reason he got picked for the job. Let's be honest. This is so ridiculous. Are we living in a fairy tale world where these things aren't happening? Of course it's happening. Because you've been coordinating and patting them on the back, you've been rewarded by getting this job. That's what he's saying, and that's what's happening. Which is the way the world has always worked. It's always worked that way. Will always work that way. But let's not pretend that we're getting some impartial person in there. That's Waleed's point. It's totally true. He's totally right. Let's not pretend that if this guy wasn't doing a lot of tweeting, he'd have this job, because he wouldn't. He wouldn't be on TV, because people wouldn't think of him as an infectious disease expert because he hadn't done a lot of work in that space. No offense. And let's not pretend that if he wasn't saying exactly what the White House liked to hear and, giving them a cheerleader speech every day, that he'd have this job. And, if somebody emails you updates and announcements and they're somebody who's a thoughtful politician, those are talking points. And you're kind of playing into that. I don't know what to say. Okay, my thoughts on this issue. I think we're in a bad place if we continue to drift into this world where Twitter takes a larger role in real life. It is not representative. David Leonhardt of the New York Times has had a number of polls recently where he looks at political ideology and beliefs on COVID. And, there's all sorts of errors along the spectrum. Totally agree. And there are definitely some people on some side of the issue who are unnecessarily vaccine reluctant, even though that they're old and deeply vulnerable and they really ought to get vaccinated. Totally agree. But on the far political left, people have an irrational view of COVID risk, and they have it totally distorted in their minds, particularly around children, and they are it has no bearing in science or reality. And I think that's really been a motivating driver for me, is to see so much of that and just be like, what is going on? You're not looking at the data because you wouldn't have such a distorted sense of risk. Those are the people who are predominantly on Twitter. They have a certain point of view. It's not where the average set point is in America. You travel this country and you look at what people are actually doing with masks and distancing and getting back to normal life, and you will see something very different than what you will see if you read Twitter. If you read Twitter and you walked outside, it would be like two different countries. And you're picking somebody from the world of Twitter, not from the world of reality. And the world of Twitter has a different set point. And this is somebody who kind of created, to some degree, good for him. He's leveraged it, but he created sort of being known as a public health person, infectious disease person from Twitter, went on TV, and now he has a really important job. But I think the worry is that his set point is not the set point of America, and it's going to lead to some conflict soon. And I also think that, when you get in the habit of praising somebody, it's awfully hard to push back. And when you're making unprecedented policy decisions, you need someone at the table who can push back and push back hard and tell you why you're wrong and tell you why that you're actually making some mistakes. And if they had some pushback, they probably wouldn't have bungled, I think. So many things they bungled. The vaccine rollout was bungled. The U.S. has a lower vaccine rate than Iran and many other nations, that we should be doing better than our boosters. We bungled. We focused so much on 20-year-olds. We didn't focus on 80-year-olds. We bungled that. The way we tried to roll out a vaccine for 6 months to 4 years old, even if you wanted that, whether you didn't want that, the way they did it, total fiasco. They got everyone excited, and they couldn't even deliver because the data weren't there. And they knew that. If you had any ounce of sense, or anyone at the table telling you, like, we can't approve based on a infinite looks at a secondary endpoint kind of thing. I've talked about that in prior videos. They've made so many mistakes. And having another yes man at the table is not going to help you when you're in the mistake business. You need somebody there to tell you when you're wrong and tell you cold and hard. And I must admit, I really enjoyed Waleed's quote in this article. I think he's spot on. I think that, Jha is repeating the talking points, and those updates and announcements he's getting are, in fact, those are talking points from the White House. And if you're going to repeat them or go along with them or support them, you are repeating White House talking points. And, that's why you got the job, let's be honest, because if you were against them all the time, you wouldn't be looking at you. But that's honest. But it does create some perverse incentives. I mean, if you think forward, there's going to be a president in there in the future that, we may have different emotions about. And that person, and people may be auditioning for that person on CNN and MSNBC and on Twitter. And I don't think you want that. I think you want somebody in there who's actually got some spine and can actually push back when they get things wrong, which they've gotten things awfully wrong. I remember one thing that I saw Ashish pushing on. He was saying that there should be the vaccine mandate for domestic air travel. That's something that they actually backed away from entirely. And that's something that, if you had, I think, common sense, you would realize it's a bad idea, because I think it was going to not do well. And I think that's ultimately why the administration didn't push ahead on that policy. There's going to be so many negative externalities from such a policy that it's going to far outweigh any potential benefits. Not to mention that airline being on the plane itself was not the prime place the virus was spreading. Anyway, and not to mention we had vaccination for like almost a year at that point. And, okay. Anyway, I don't know what to say about that issue. It was a bad policy. So Twitter is not real life. But it is increasingly affecting real life, and that's the problem. And the more it affects our real life, the more we're indebted to this tiny group of people that is not even close to the center of America. So I guess the only thing sensible people can do, people who have different points of view, I guess you could go on there to try to average it out and actually inject some common sense. That's one possibility. I guess we could try to encourage reporters to not be so lazy and try to call somebody who's actually got a track record in the field rather than the person who just tweeted that day. But I'm not too optimistic we're going to do that. Anyway, those are just some thoughts on this issue. If you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. Until next time,